Welcome, dear listeners, to a most curious case. In the quiet village of Mildred's, a priest is found dead inside his own confession booth. What secret was whispered before his final breath? And who was the veiled woman seen that morning? Join Miss Marple as she uncovers deceit beneath the calm charm of English village life in The Priest Who Died in His Own Confession Booth. Where are you listening from? Do tell us in the comments below. It was one of those tranquil mornings in the village of Mildred's, the kind that seemed to belong entirely to the sound of birdsong and the faint clatter of teacups. The air was bright with late spring, the hedgerows freshly trimmed, and the roses in Mrs. Weatherby's front garden already daring to bloom ahead of the season. Nothing, it seemed, could disturb the charming predictability of village life. At precisely 10 minutes past 9, the Reverend Arthur Pembroke unlocked the side door of Luke's church, humming a faint psalm. He was a man of about 60. Amiable and dignified, though lately rather more distracted than usual. The business of parish life was relentless, the fete to organize, the flower committee's latest quarrel to settle, and the new curate's sermons to review, yet none of it seemed to trouble him more than his upcoming appointment that morning. By 10 o'clock, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Edith Pembroke, was seen walking briskly toward the church with a basket of hydrangeas. She greeted Miss Jane Marple, who happened to be pruning her sweet peas along the church path. "Good morning, Miss Marple." Arthur's insisted on hearing confessions this morning, a new idea of his. "Something about bringing the parish closer together," she said with a laugh that carried a hint of worry. "How very commendable," Miss Marple replied mildly, snipping another flower. "Though I do wonder if it mightn't be a trifle early in the week for confessions. People usually prefer to sin over the weekend, don't they?" Mrs. Pembroke chuckled, thanked her for the flowers she'd promised for Sunday service, and went on her way. The two women could not have guessed that by noon, Luke's would be filled not with hymns but with whispers and the faint, sickly scent of candle wax over death. It was Mrs. Groves, the verger's wife, who first raised the alarm. She had gone into the church to dust the altar steps when she noticed the confessional door ajar. Thinking it odd, she peered in and screamed. Within the dim wooden booth sat the Reverend Pembroke, motionless, his head bowed as though in prayer. But his hands were limp in his lap, and his lips were tinged with the faintest bluish hue. By the time the constable arrived, half the village had gathered at the churchyard gate. "The doctor pronounced the Reverend quite dead, most likely of heart failure," he said, though the peculiar expression on his face gave Miss Marple pause. It was not fear, exactly, nor peace. Something between the two, a man surprised but not by death itself. As the gossip rippled through the village like wind through reeds, theories blossomed as fast as the roses. "He was overworked," declared Mrs. Bantry at the post office. "Heart failure, most like," agreed Mr. Pritchard, though he added darkly. "Funny, though. Said he'd been worried lately, about something he'd heard in confession, so I was told." And so the tale began that the good Reverend Pembroke had died in his own confessional, moments after hearing something terrible. That evening, as the church bell tolled softly in mourning, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, the sunset laying soft gold upon the thatched roofs below. Her needles clicked in patient rhythm as she considered what she had seen, the way the confessional door had been slightly open, the faint scent of almonds in the air, and the curious fact that the Reverend's stole had been folded neatly beside him rather than around his shoulders. It was all, she thought, quite unlike any natural death she'd ever known. And Jane Marple had known more than most about the many ways people find to send one another quietly to their graves. The news passed from kettle to doorstep with the ruthless efficiency of village shock, and by late afternoon Mildred's had arranged itself into those small clumps of speculation that flower like dandelions after a shower. Mrs. Groves, fortified by tea and trembling importance, told the butcher she had never seen the Reverend so still. The butcher told his wife, who told the dressmaker, who told her customer that death in a confessional must have something to do with sin that refused to travel alone. By the time the school children were dismissed, the lanes were thronged with talk, and the talk had already become history firm, embroidered, and in parts entirely invented. Miss Marple, who knew that truth, when passed from hand to hand, is like cream on a hot day, apt to sour, kept her counsel and went about with her marketing basket. On her gatepost lay a neat card in Edith Pembroke's firm hand. "Do call if you can." She went at once to the vicarage, carrying a lemon drizzle cake because grief sits better when it is offered a slice. The house had the hush of rooms where music has stopped mid-phrase. Edith received her in the morning room. The hydrangeas from earlier were already beginning to look as though they regretted blooming. "I make a poor hostess," Edith said, folding and unfolding a very clean handkerchief. "Arthur kept such orderly hours. I cannot think how to keep them now." "Time behaves better when given something simple to do," Miss Marple said, and let silence be the saucer in which sorrow cooled. Presently Edith talked. The Reverend had risen early, written a few lines in his diary, and said there was a matter of duty he must set right. He had decided quite out of routine to hear confessions that morning, and had insisted on being alone. He said he would set it down afterward. Edith murmured. "Those were his words. Set it down. I have found nothing." She glanced helplessly toward the little escritoire. The constable took his diary. "Then we must allow paper to remember for a while," Miss Marple said. They spoke of lemons and laundering and, briefly, the sins of rose beetles. And the vicar's wife's breathing steadied a little. When she left, Miss Marple met the curate on the path, a boyish figure made angular by wakefulness. "I was to assist," Mr. Pierce blurted before she could inquire. "He told me not to attend only today because privacy would be salutary." He swallowed. "The doctor says heart failure. Doctors are very sensible until imagination catches them up," Miss Marple said. "Do sleep, Mr. Pierce. Fatigue makes the world dishonest in small ways." His smile was automatic and did not reach his eyes. She did not go straight home. From the churchyard she could see the side door of Luke's bound with the constable's paper as with a bandage. On the paving by the porch, a narrow crescent of candle wax glimmered like a dropped moon. Mr. Groves, the verger, approached with a bucket and a stiff brush, touched his cap, and, perceiving her glance, scuffed at the wax with unusual zeal. "Untidy," he said, not meeting her eye. "One must always tidy what wax remembers," she returned mildly, and saw his ears grow pink. At the post office, the queue had grown large on slender business. Mrs. Bantry, who kept a keen nervous system for omens, confided that at 11 exactly her teapot clicked twice against the tray, which meant catastrophe. Mr. Pritchard reported a row about hymn choices. Mrs. Weatherby, affronted at whispers of almond scent, declared her lotion was lavender, and what is more, that a stranger had asked her the way to Luke's at 10:30, a tall lady in a veiled hat and gloves, the colour of pewter, speaking with the clipped ease of London. The stranger had not, Mrs. Weatherby added, purchased so much as a stamp, which was proof enough of character. "A person who shuns stamps shuns receipts," Mrs. Bantry observed. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "and sometimes a person carries only exact change for confession." She inquired as if idly which road the lady had taken, the lane by Miller's cottage. Whether she seemed hurried, no, only deliberate. And whether she asked for the Reverend by name. She did. The answers settled in her mind with the soft click of pebbles dropping into a jar. By evening, the doctor's provisional statement lay over the village like cold gravy. Heart failure, pending inquiry. Miss Marple's needles clicked at her window while the light thinned on thatch. She arranged what she knew, a folded stole curious, a promised note absent, a crescent of wax scrubbed, a stranger deliberate, a curate excluded. She thought of the faint, sweet tang, that had lived at the edge of the church air and then gone shy. Almonds may be innocent, she reflected, and also not. When the hour struck, she rose. After death, objects shift their loyalties. Candles remember hands, paper remembers pens. If attended to before the night makes accomplices of them, they still answer simple questions. She wrapped her shawl and chose the path toward Miller's cottage. It would be neighborly to ask Mrs. Groves about a handkerchief mislaid near the porch, and quite accidental to arrive at the lich gate just as Mr. Pierce came from the vestry. A village tells its truth in the spaces between meetings, and Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime in those spaces, went to listen. The path to Miller's cottage wound between elderflower hedges, their blossoms silver in the gloaming, and Miss Marple's sensible shoes made almost no sound upon the worn stones. She could already see the faint light in the Groves' window, domestic, unremarkable, and somehow reassuring. Yet her mind was full of the morning's events, threading them as one might a string of mismatched beads, waiting for the pattern to declare itself. Mrs. Groves answered the door with her apron still on, startled but not displeased. "Why, Miss Marple? You gave me a turn. Do come in if you don't mind the kitchen. Mr. Groves has gone to polish the brass candlesticks for tomorrow, though I said there's no service to polish for." "I shall be delighted with the kitchen," Miss Marple replied. "A working room tells one more of a house than any drawing room could." Mrs. Groves flushed with the mild satisfaction that comes from being considered practical. She poured tea, explaining all the while that she hadn't touched the confessional since morning, and how strange it had been to find the Reverend so still, like he'd gone to sleep but forgot to breathe. Miss Marple nodded gravely. "And did you notice anything unusual about the place? Anything moved or missing?" "Not missing, exactly. Though I did find a man's handkerchief under the pew, just outside the booth. Plain white, no mark. I put it aside there, on the dresser." "Ah." Miss Marple examined it lightly. No embroidery, no scent. Quite ordinary, but these little things often speak truth when people do not. Mrs. Groves blinked, unsure whether that was comfort or warning. They talked a little longer, mostly about the visiting lady, whom Mrs. Groves had also seen from the vestry door. She came from the lane, I think. Waited by the porch till the Reverend called for confession. I thought her a widow, by her veil. She went in and came out maybe 10 minutes later, quick and quiet. Then I heard him call, 'Next,' but there was no one else waiting. And after she left?" "After?" Mrs. Groves frowned, thinking. "Now you mention it. I don't rightly recall hearing the Reverend move. It was quiet a long while. Then, well, I went to dust the altar, and, by the time I came back," she trailed off. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the stove, where the kettle began its soft murmur. "A long while, you say. Did anyone else come to the church in that time? Mr. Pierce, perhaps. I heard footsteps by the porch but thought nothing of it. He often comes to check the candles." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "So he does." She thanked Mrs. Groves, tucked the handkerchief into her bag with gentle insistence that she would return it if claimed, and stepped back into the cool night. The air carried the smell of lilac and damp earth. Somewhere, down the lane, an owl called a lonely, deliberate sound. As she passed the churchyard, she saw a figure standing by the gate, coat collar up, hands folded behind his back. It was Inspector Harwood, the county man summoned for the inquiry. He was solid, neat, and brisk, the sort of man who measured progress in footprints and fingerprints. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "Still out gathering rumors, I see?" "Rumors, Inspector, are the poor man's library," she replied. "They are rarely accurate but often educational." He smiled despite himself. "Well, there's talk enough to fill a library today. Doctor sticks to heart failure, though I'll be surprised if the coroner doesn't ask questions about that smell of almonds the verger mentioned." "It might be nothing more than imagination," she said gently, "though imagination has a curious habit of imitating truth. Harwood gave a short laugh. You think someone helped the Reverend along? I think, Miss Marple replied, that the Reverend Pembroke was not a man who frightened easily. And he was frightened, Inspector. His hands told me so. He'd folded them neatly, but the nails had bitten his palms. The inspector's brows drew together. You notice too much, Miss Marple. Only what's there to be noticed. They parted amicably, though each knew the other would continue the same inquiry along very different lines. Miss Marple returned home, the lamplight of her cottage, a small beacon among the darkened hedgerows. Inside, she set the handkerchief on the table and stared at it as though it might speak. Then she reached for her knitting, letting the rhythm steady her thoughts. Somewhere in that ordinary square of linen, in the folded stole, in the stranger's silence, there was a connection. She could feel it hovering, fragile as spider silk, waiting for the faintest tremor to reveal its pattern. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would visit the curate again. The young man's nerves were frayed not only by grief. Guilt, she had long ago observed, wears the same expression until it remembers to blink. And Mr. Pierce, she suspected, had blinked too late. The next morning broke grey and uneasy, as if the village itself sensed that something remained unfinished. Mist lay heavy over the churchyard, curling around gravestones like unspoken thoughts. Miss Marple, having risen early, had already finished her tea and written a brief note of condolence for Mrs. Pembroke's sympathy, she always said, should arrive before casseroles had cooled and before pity became fashionable. She then wrapped her shawl and set out once again toward Luke's. The constable, a good-hearted but simple man named Ellis, stood by the lich-gate with a clipboard and a stubborn sense of duty. He brightened at Miss Marple's approach. "Good morning, ma'am. I've been told no one's to enter just yet. Inspector's orders." "I should hope not," said Miss Marple kindly. "I was merely walking to the churchyard to lay a few flowers." Grief is often softened by ritual. Ellis nodded gravely and let her pass. She moved with the unhurried air of one paying respects, but, in truth, her eyes lingered on the church's side entrance, the same one the Reverend had used on that final morning. It was no longer sealed. A faint scent of polish and candle wax drifted through the air. Though beneath it, sharper and more elusive, there was something else, an echo of almonds that had not yet quite faded. Inside, the nave stood dim and still. Miss Marple's steps were light, respectful. The confessional had been left slightly ajar again. Someone, perhaps the inspector, had been examining it. She touched the edge of the wooden frame, tracing the grain where the varnish had worn away with use. There, almost hidden in the crevice near the floor, was a tiny shred of something pale. She bent closer. A wisp of fine grey thread, no larger than an eyelash, caught between the boards. It might have been from a glove or a veil. She left it where it was, for she never disturbed what was not yet ready to be noticed. "Miss Marple," came a sharp but not unfriendly voice. Inspector Harwood stood in the aisle, his notebook half out of his pocket. "You do have a habit of appearing where I least expect you." "Curiosity, Inspector," she said, straightening, "a vice the Almighty has yet to cure in me." He smiled faintly. "I can't fault it. There's something irregular here. I'll grant you that." The doctor's second look turned up traces of something in the Reverend's stomach. A chemical of some sort, enough to raise suspicion. "Cyanide," Miss Marple murmured, and when he looked startled, she added, "I dare say the almond scent led you to the same conclusion." Harwood nodded. "Likely from a sweet or drink taken before confession, though heaven knows how it was given to him." "Poison," she said softly, "is an instrument of thought rather than strength. It requires confidence and calculation, which narrows it down to about half the village." Harwood sighed. "Still, we've one possible lead. That stranger, the lady in the veil. No one seems to know her." "Not yet," said Miss Marple. But strangers do not remain strangers long in Mildred's. She will have touched something, spoken to someone, left a footprint where none belonged. It only takes a little watching. They walked together to the porch, where the inspector paused. "You're suggesting she knew the Reverend personally?" "I suggest," Miss Marple replied, "that she knew him well enough to make him afraid. And that kind of fear, Inspector, does not come from anonymous confession." He regarded her for a long moment, before making a note in his book. "You'll be the death of my patience one day, Miss Marple." "Patience," she said mildly, "is merely the polite form of curiosity." When she left the church, she did not go directly home. Instead, she made her way to the curate's lodgings, a small, ivy-clad building beside the rectory garden. Mr. Pierce answered her knock almost at once, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "Miss Marple," he said, startled. I didn't expect visitors. Grief doesn't wait for manners," she said gently. "May I come in? I've been thinking about something your vicar said the day before he died." He hesitated but stepped aside. The room was tidy, though the books on his desk lay open and disordered. On one, she noticed a bookmark pressed into a passage on confession and absolution. Another volume, on moral theology, lay face down as if abandoned mid-thought. "I only wanted to ask," Miss Marple continued, "whether the Reverend had confided in you about any particular anxiety." Pierce's hands tightened on the back of a chair. He was uneasy. "Yes, said he'd heard something dreadful, something that must be dealt with before Sunday. But he wouldn't tell me what it was." "Did he mention names?" "No, only that sin," the young man whispered, "was never as far from virtue as people like to think." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "A very profound observation, Mr. Pierce, though it sometimes means that the sinner is nearer home than he realizes." Sharply at her, as if uncertain whether she had meant something more, she rose, leaving him pale and thoughtful. Outside, the mist had thinned, revealing the crooked charm of the cottages beyond. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter, her mind quietly ticking. The Reverend had been poisoned after hearing a confession, perhaps, too dangerous to live with. Someone had feared exposure, enough to silence him before the next Sunday sermon. And if she was not mistaken, the silencing had begun not in the church, but long before, in the heart of someone who believed themselves unseen. Miss Marple walked home through the thin morning mist, her thoughts moving with deliberate clarity. The village was stirring into life. Milk carts rattled along the lanes, and somewhere a dog barked at the grocer's boy. Yet beneath the surface calm, she sensed the quiet tremor that follows a crime not yet understood. Villagers greeted her with sympathy meant for Edith Pembroke, but behind their eyes lay curiosity, sharpened by fear. In a place like Mildred's, death was an event, murder, an education. At her cottage, Miss Marple set down her shawl, lit the fire, and poured herself another cup of tea. She took out the folded handkerchief from the previous evening and spread it neatly upon the table. It was plain linen. No initial stitched, no hint of scent. Yet she studied it, as though it contained a language of its own. The edges were faintly rough, as if the fabric had been washed often but ironed without care. The sort of handkerchief a man might use daily, not something delicate or feminine. Mr. Pierce had been anxious, the verger furtive. And yet, she thought, the handkerchief might belong to neither. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, looking as pleased as if she had discovered a headline. "My dear Miss Marple, I thought you ought to know there's talk of that stranger again. Mrs. Weatherby swears she saw her on the afternoon train to Market Broughton. A tall lady with that same veil and gloves. Sat alone, she did, and carried a black case. Oh, it gives me shivers." Miss Marple invited her in, poured tea, and listened with polite attentiveness. When Mrs. Bantry left, she stood for a moment by the window, watching the old iron gates of the church glint faintly through the mist. A black case, a veiled woman, and a priest dead in his confessional. The pieces were aligning, but the pattern was far from clear. By mid-morning, Inspector Harwood arrived, bringing with him a faint scent of tobacco and the weary impatience of a man who disliked mysteries that refused to be practical. "I've just been speaking with the chemist," he announced. "He's missing a small quantity of potassium cyanide. Says it's used for photographic work, and a bottle was sold last week." "Ah," Miss Marple said quietly. "And to whom?" He frowned. "That's the problem. Paid in cash. Description matches no one, precisely, though the chemist recalls a person wearing gloves." Said the voice was soft, polite. "Politeness," Miss Marple murmured, "has hidden more wickedness than lies ever did." He glanced at her sharply. "You think it's the woman in the veil?" "Perhaps," she said. "Though gloves are not limited to women, and a veil, you know, hides little from one who wishes to be seen." Harwood sighed. "The coroner's report confirms poisoning. The dose was enough to act within minutes. It could have been administered by drink or even on the tongue, disguised." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Then whoever gave it to him did so, knowing precisely when he would die. Such timing requires calmness and access." The inspector nodded. "Which brings us to our next question. What was in that confession that cost the Reverend his life?" "That," Miss Marple said softly, "depends upon who was confessing." That afternoon, she took her usual walk through the village, stopping now and then to greet neighbors, her manner as mild as ever. Yet every encounter added another quiet thread to the tapestry she was weaving. The grocer mentioned that the curate had bought wine from him 2 days before the vicar's death communion wine. He'd said, though oddly enough, "Only 1 bottle." Mrs. Groves, the verger's wife, told her that she'd seen Mr. Pierce burning papers in the vicarage garden the night before. "Said they were old sermons," she added, "but the smoke had a queer smell like varnish." When Miss Marple reached the lane near the vicarage, she slowed her pace. Through the hedge she saw the young curate again, pacing the garden with his head bowed, a letter clutched in one hand. His face bore the strained expression of a man balancing fear and guilt. She watched him a moment longer before turning home. She would not speak to him again yet. Guilt, she knew, required ripening before it yielded truth. That evening she sat by her window, the sunset spilling across the rooftops in slow gold. On the table lay the handkerchief, folded precisely in half, and beside it a small notebook in which she had begun to record her observations. The faint smell of almonds, the Reverend's folded stole, the mysterious woman, the missing cyanide, and now the curate's fire. She paused, knitting her brows. One clue alone was missing: the motive. Sin, the Reverend had said, was nearer to virtue than people liked to think, and Miss Marple, who had seen enough of human weakness to know how love and guilt entwined like ivy on a church wall, began to suspect that the crime had not sprung from hate, but from devotion twisted out of shape. Outside, the church bell rang softly, calling the faithful to evensong. Few would come tonight. But Miss Marple, laying aside her notebook, smiled faintly to herself. She had an idea where she might find the truth if only she could persuade one frightened heart to tell it. The following morning dawned crisp and still, a thin veil of frost resting upon the churchyard grass, as if nature herself wished to preserve the solemnity of Luke's. Miss Marple was awake before sunrise. Sleep had eluded her. Her mind was busy arranging the puzzle pieces that had begun, ever so faintly, to form an image. She dressed quietly, wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, and looked out the window toward the vicarage. A faint curl of smoke rose from its chimney, unusual at that hour. Someone else, it seemed, had found the night a difficult companion. After breakfast, she stepped out into the lane. Her walk was purposeful but unhurried, the gait of someone for whom every minute was an old friend. When she arrived at the vicarage, she found Edith Pembroke in the garden, cutting the last of the chrysanthemums. The widow's hands were steady now, but her eyes carried a muted sorrow that seemed to have settled in rather than passed through. "Miss Marple," she greeted softly. "How kind of you to visit again." The inspector has been by so many questions. They've taken Arthur's diary for evidence. Imagine that. Evidence, Miss Marple said, has the peculiar habit of showing itself in what people overlook. She accepted the invitation to sit in the parlor where the scent of beeswax and old books clung to the air. Her eyes fell upon a photograph on the mantel, Reverend Pembroke, smiling faintly, his hand resting on the shoulder of a young man. "Your husband thought very highly of Mr. Pierce," she observed. "Yes," Edith said, pausing. "Arthur believed in second chances. Mr. Pierce was troubled when he first came to us. Arthur said he reminded him of himself at that age. He worked tirelessly for the parish. But lately," she stopped, choosing her words carefully. "Lately, there was strain. I fear Arthur discovered something that shook him deeply. He was not one to gossip, but I saw the worry in his eyes." "Did he confide anything to you?" "Only that he had been told something in confession that must never be repeated, and that it endangered more than one soul. I begged him to let it go, but he said he could not." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Truth has a way of insisting upon being heard, my dear, even when one would rather close the door upon it." A clock chimed softly in the hall. From outside came the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. A moment later, the door opened, and Mr. Pierce appeared. His face paled slightly when he saw Miss Marple, but he composed himself with a nervous smile. "I didn't realize we had company," he said. "Merely a friendly call," Miss Marple replied. "Your rector's wife and I were just remembering old sermons." He nodded, though his hands fidgeted. "I was heading to the church to prepare for the memorial. Inspector Harwood says it may proceed tomorrow, once the coroner's formalities are done." "Such efficiency," Miss Marple murmured. "The living are always so eager to tidy away the dead." Through the window, they watched him stride down the path, the black of his coat cutting sharply against the pale morning. After a moment, Miss Marple rose. "My dear, I shall leave you to your flowers. There is something I must see for myself." Her next stop was the chemist's shop, where the bell above the door tinkled gently as she entered. Mr. Copley, the chemist, greeted her with mild surprise. "Miss Marple, you've not come for liniment, I hope?" "No, indeed," she said cheerfully. "I wondered if you might indulge a small curiosity. I heard tell that someone purchased cyanide from you recently for photographic use, I believe." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, that's true. A week ago. Paid in cash. I couldn't see much of them, hat pulled low. Gloves on, but I thought the voice was male. Educated. Pleasant enough." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "That is rather different from what one might expect of a lady in a veil, don't you think?" His brows drew together. "A lady?" "No, ma'am, unless she had a voice like a choirman." Miss Marple thanked him, bought a small tin of lavender salve as pretext, and left. Outside, she stood for a long moment, letting the village hum quietly around her, the postcart rattling past, Mrs. Bantry gossiping in the doorway, the church bell marking the hour. Her eyes narrowed slightly. A man's voice, soft and educated. Gloves, cash, cyanide. When she returned home, she found a letter waiting, slipped through the door. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. She opened it carefully. "Miss Marple, I beg you not to concern yourself further. The Reverend's death was God's will. Please leave it be." There was no signature. Miss Marple folded the note with great care and placed it beside the handkerchief. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, very quietly, she murmured, "When God's will is written in a trembling hand, it is rarely his." She looked out toward the church, where the afternoon sun had begun to burn away the frost. Somewhere behind those old stone walls lay the truth concealed not by mystery, but by someone's desperate attempt to preserve a reputation already spoiled. She would wait until nightfall. There are conversations, she knew, that can only occur when darkness grants people the courage to speak. The light had fallen low behind the roofs when Miss Marple settled herself by the window once again, her knitting untouched beside her. She had spent the afternoon in reflection, weighing what she knew against what still hid itself from reason. The anonymous letter lay on the table beside her teacup, its plain envelope bearing the faintest scent of ink and starch, freshly written, perhaps within the hour. The hand was neat, deliberate, and masculine, someone who wanted her silence but could not resist the temptation to issue a warning. And that, she thought, was the mark of guilt more than menace. Outside, the village was quiet. The memorial service for Reverend Pembroke was to be held the next morning, and a subdued solemnity had settled over Mildred's. Curtains were drawn early, as though people feared the night might listen. Yet Miss Marple, in her unassuming patience, knew that darkness was when truth most often dared to breathe. At 8:30, a soft knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, she found Edith Pembroke standing on the step, her shawl clutched tightly around her. Her face was pale but resolved. "I couldn't stay in the house alone," she said quickly. "Forgive me. But something dreadful has happened, something I cannot explain." Miss Marple guided her inside, poured tea, and waited. It never did to hurry a confession. "It was this evening," Edith whispered. "I went into Arthur's study to gather his papers, letters, notes for the sermon he never gave. I found something wedged behind the drawer. It's a letter, Miss Marple, in Arthur's hand but unfinished." She produced a folded page, slightly creased, and laid it upon the table. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read in silence. The handwriting was firm, the ink still dark. "My dear Edith, should anything happen to me, you must not blame the young man. His sin was not cruelty but weakness, and I fear another's influence has led him astray. I am resolved to speak with her once more, though it may cost me dearly. Truth must be faced, even when forgiveness is not sought." The letter broke off abruptly there, as if the pen had been lifted mid-sentence. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "The young man," she said softly. "That would be Mr. Pierce, I presume. And her the veiled woman, no doubt." Edith nodded miserably. "Arthur never told me who she was, but now I am sure she was someone from his past, someone who came to torment him." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "From his past? Not Mr. Pierce's? I thought at first it must concern Mr. Pierce, but I overheard something once months ago. Arthur and the curate were speaking in the garden. Arthur said, 'You must not let her return, my boy. No good ever came of silence when she is near.' I thought it some parish matter. Now I wonder." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "You are certain those were his words?" "Quite certain." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "Then it is time, my dear." That silence ended, but we must proceed with gentleness. The truth, when frightened, flees like a bird. It must be coaxed, not chased. When Edith had gone, Miss Marple wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and stepped into the night. The village lay under a still, silver moon. She moved quietly through the churchyard, where the long shadows of yews brushed against the stone path. The side door of Luke's was unlocked. The inspector must have left it so after his final examination. Inside, the air was cold, scented faintly with wax and dust. A faint creak came from the vestry. Miss Marple's hand rested lightly on the pew rail as she listened. Then, with unhurried calm, she said, "You might as well come out, Mr. Pierce. Footsteps have a particular echo on this floor, and yours are unmistakable." The curate emerged from the shadows, his face pale and strained. "Miss Marple, I didn't mean to startle you. I come here to pray. I can't sleep. I imagine prayer sits uneasily when burdened with guilt," she said gently. "It's better to share it than let it grow heavy." He looked away. "You don't understand." Perhaps I do. You loved the Reverend as a father, and someone used that love against you. He died protecting you from a secret, not your own. The young man's lips trembled. I didn't poison him, he burst out. I swear I didn't. He told me he was meeting her that morning to help her, he said. He didn't know what she was capable of. I begged him not to go into the confessional alone. She, Mr. Pierce? His voice dropped to a whisper. Her name was Lydia Harcourt. She was once engaged to him years ago, before he joined the church. She ruined another man's life then. She came here last month, claiming repentance, but Arthur grew frightened after speaking with her. He said her soul was beyond confession. Miss Marple's heart beat evenly, though her mind raced. Lydia Harcourt, the name stirred memory. A scandal from years past involving forged inheritances and a suicide in Bath. A woman who vanished when her lies collapsed. And where is she now? I don't know, he said, shaking. But I think she means to leave again before the service tomorrow. She sent me a note this morning, told me to burn it, said she'd confess everything if I met her tonight at the old rectory. I was going there when I heard you. Miss Marple laid a hand on his arm. No, Mr. Pierce, you will not go. Not tonight. There are some meetings that should happen only under watchful eyes. I believe our inspector will be grateful for a destination. She looked toward the darkened windows of the church, where the moonlight trembled across the confessional door. The Reverend had died forgiving a sin that was never repented, and if she judged correctly, that same sin had now returned to finish its work. Miss Marple's words hung in the cold air of the church, absorbed by the stone walls that had listened to centuries of secrets. Mr. Pierce stood motionless, his breath trembling in the half-light that filtered through the stained glass window. The name Lydia Harcourt had entered the space like a ghost, long banished, but not gone. Miss Marple regarded him quietly, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp as a needle. You did well to tell me, she said at last. Fear, Mr. Pierce, is like ink spilled on blotting paper. It spreads, it stains, and it blurs everything else until one cannot see the truth at all. But once the truth is spoken aloud, it begins to dry. The young curate pressed his shaking hands together. You think she killed him, don't you? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that the Reverend Pembroke's death was not the work of malice alone, but of someone who mistook righteousness for power. And that, my dear young man, is a far more dangerous poison. They left the church together, walking under the watchful moon. The lane toward the old rectory was lined with overgrown hawthorn, their branches forming dark arches overhead. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her senses alert to every rustle. The house beyond, long abandoned after the previous rector's death, stood with its windows dark, its roof silvered with dew. Inspector Harwood and Constable Ellis arrived a few minutes later, their carriage wheels muffled by damp earth. The inspector stepped down, irritation mingled with curiosity. I received your message, Miss Marple, he said. Another late-night excursion. I see. You're certain this isn't some misunderstanding? Quite certain, she replied. The woman we seek will come here tonight. She has no choice. She believes she must tie up loose ends before morning, and when guilt becomes a noose, Inspector, it tightens most at the moment one thinks oneself safe. He gave her a long, assessing look. Very well, we'll keep watch. They hid among the trees near the rectory, the air cold and still. Mr. Pierce was instructed to remain near the gate, visible but not alone. His nervous pacing would serve as bait well enough. Guilt, Miss Marple had often observed, had a scent that drew its own predators. The minutes stretched, heavy with silence. Then, at last, the faint crunch of gravel. From the shadowed lane emerged a figure cloaked in dark grey, a veil obscuring her face even in the moonlight. She walked with the poise of someone accustomed to control, but her movements carried the quick tension of a cornered thing. When she saw Pierce, she stopped. You fool, she hissed, her voice low, cultured, and bitterly cold. "Why are you not alone?" I couldn't," he stammered, but she silenced him with a raised hand. "Did you burn the note?" He nodded mutely. "Good. You were always obedient. I thought perhaps you'd learned defiance since last we met. It seems you have not." She stepped closer, her tone softening. "You understand, don't you? Arthur was going to expose us both. He wrote to me, demanded that I confess to the police what I'd done years ago. He said silence was no longer possible. I had to stop him. It was mercy, really. He would have been ruined." "Mercy?" The word escaped Pierce as a choked whisper. "You poisoned him." Her gloved hand trembled slightly, then steadied. "I saved him from disgrace, and you should thank me, my dear, for saving you too." He was going to tell them about the money, about how I persuaded you to sign his name on that check. The inspector stepped from the shadows then, his revolver leveled, though his tone remained measured. "That's quite enough, Mrs. Harcourt." The woman froze, her veil turning slightly toward him. "Inspector Harwood, I see Miss Marple has been whispering her tales again." Miss Marple appeared from the path, serene as ever. "Not tales, my dear, merely the truth, which, like most unpleasant things, prefers to be aired." Lydia's laughter was soft, brittle. "Do you truly think I'll confess because an old woman asks me to?" "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that you already have. You spoke of saving the Reverend from disgrace, of protecting Mr. Pierce. But the Reverend's letter unfinished, though it was named both your influence and your intent. It was found behind his drawer, you see. You hid the truth well, Mrs. Harcourt, but not perfectly. And your note to Mr. Pierce this morning? Rather too hasty in its phrasing. The handwriting matches your signature on old parish documents, the same flourish in your capital H." Lydia went very still. "You read my letters?" "Just the one you intended me to read," Miss Marple said. "The anonymous warning you sent to my cottage. You wanted to frighten me off. But in doing so, you proved yourself local, someone with knowledge of my address and the confidence to approach unseen. Quite impossible for a stranger who had already fled the village. Don't you agree?" For a heartbeat, the night seemed to stop breathing. Then Lydia tore off her veil. Her face, pale and elegant, bore the marks of a beauty grown brittle through vanity. "You meddling hag," she spat. "You think I'll let you drag me down with that pathetic curate?" Harwood stepped forward, but she moved first swiftly, gracefully drawing from her bag a small silver flask. Before anyone could stop her, she raised it to her lips. Miss Marple's voice was calm, though her eyes sharpened. "No, Mrs. Harcourt, that will not do. The poison has already served its purpose once. You will not use it for escape a second time." The inspector seized her arm, wrenching the flask away. Its contents spilled onto the ground, the air filling instantly with the sharp, unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. Lydia gave a cry, half fury, half despair, and sank to her knees. "It was all for him," she whispered, her gaze darting to Pierce. "He said he'd love me once it was done, but he looked at me as though I were something filthy. I had to silence Arthur, he knew too much." Mr. Pierce covered his face with his hands, weeping quietly. The inspector signaled Ellis, who stepped forward to take Lydia into custody. As they led her away, she turned once more to Miss Marple. "You think you understand goodness, old woman, but goodness is only cowardice in a prettier dress." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "No, my dear. Goodness is the courage to tell the truth, even when it hurts. You only ever chose comfort." When the carriage rolled away toward the station, taking Lydia Harcourt and the remnants of her deceit, the night seemed to exhale. Mr. Pierce stood beside the church gate, silent, the burden of confession heavy but at last unhidden. "You have a difficult road ahead," Miss Marple said softly. "But confession, Mr. Pierce, is not the end of faith, it is where it begins again." He bowed his head. You saved my soul, Miss Marple. She shook her head gently. Oh no, my dear boy. You saved it yourself the moment you stopped lying. The dawn began to edge over the hills, pale and tentative. Miss Marple turned toward home, her small figure diminishing along the lane. Behind her, the church bell tolled for the memorial that would now serve as both farewell and absolution. The village would gossip for weeks, as villages do, but soon the story would settle into legend of the priest who died in his own confessional, and of the quiet old lady who had once again seen through the veils that others so carefully wore. Morning came pale and damp, the mist unwilling to lift from the lyche gate as if it, too, wished to keep its veil. The village moved with a careful hush. Blinds rose halfway, doors murmured open and shut, and women carried flowers, as though they feared dropping not petals but memories. Lydia Harcourt had been taken away under the cold supervision of the law, and there was talk, satisfied talk, that things would right themselves now. But Miss Marple, who had never yet known wickedness to end where it first appeared, felt that small interior tug which was her mind's equivalent of a finger laid gently against a page weight. Do not turn just yet. The memorial service stood for noon. Before that, she went first to the doctor. Dr. Bell, fussy and precise, prided himself on being unimpressionable. He received Miss Marple with the air of one who tolerates, and the elderly because they are inevitable. You were right about cyanide, he admitted, peering at her over his spectacles. Gastric contents confirmed. It acts quickly within minutes, sometimes seconds, depending upon the dose and form. Within minutes, Miss Marple repeated mildly. So a man would not linger long, doctor, after swallowing it. Hardly long enough to collect his thoughts, I'm afraid. She thanked him and went on, her steps turning naturally toward Miller's cottage. Mrs. Groves, looking both flattered and harassed by the unenviable position of being a witness, poured tea that slopped into saucers. Miss Marple's questions were small, stitched with sympathy, never sharp enough to snag. You heard the Reverend say, "Next," after the lady left, she murmured. Oh yes, Miss Marple. Clear as anything. He had that voice that carries, like bells. And then no one answered, no one that I saw. I went to the altar rail with the duster. It must have been a quarter hour, near enough the half, before I went back and looked in the booth again. And, well, Mrs. Groves swallowed and looked at her hands. But I did hear footsteps by the porch not long after he called. I thought it must be Mr. Pierce. As I've said. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church path. The bells, my dear. Did you hear Luke's chime the half hour? Why? Yes, it chimed the half exactly as I went to see why he hadn't called again. Just so, Miss Marple said, and let the silence close like a neat seam. By the time she crossed the green, the village had begun its gentle pilgrimage to Luke's. The nave filled with the subdued rustle of black sleeves and the soft weight of breathing. Edith Pembroke sat in the front pew, composed in that way grief sometimes is when it cannot yet afford collapse. Mr. Pierce, pale but steady, took his place to read the lesson. His voice, when it came, was low and musical, kind that makes truths sound kinder than they are. Miss Marple watched him, not unkindly. The young man had a fragility that would draw a rescuer in any parish. She had seen it before in kittens and curates, but fragility, she knew, could be very dangerous when it learnt the trick of appearing harmless. On the far side aisle stood Inspector Harwood, hands behind his back, his eyes travelling between the widow and the curate, and returning, with relieved economy, to emptiness. To him the matter was settled, and he was already thinking of supper. After the service, there was tea in the church hall. There always is, because sorrow requires biscuits, and people require something to do with their hands. Miss Marple drifted through the small crowd, hearing Lydia's name slip like a dropped pin from conversation to conversation. She carried a plate and no appetite. When Mr. Pierce came near, she lifted a small linen square from her bag and held it up with gentle politeness. I believe this. Maybe yours, Mr. Pierce. I found it near the confessional plain. Well used. Such things often wander at inconvenient moments. He looked at it, and there, for the briefest fraction, his eyes did something the eyes of the innocent rarely do. They measured the distance between a thing and its consequence. Then he smiled. A fraction late, but a smile nonetheless. I don't think so, Miss Marple. I always keep mine marked. He produced from his sleeve a monogrammed handkerchief as demonstration P, neatly stitched in one corner. How sensible, Miss Marple said, tucking the plain one away again. Monograms prevent such orphanages as drawers become. She turned and asked Edith, in a voice as soft as wool, whether Arthur had ever been plagued by his throat when speaking. Oh yes, Edith said. In winter especially. He kept lozenges in the vestry. Mr. Pierce bought them for him at the chemist. That, Miss Marple thought, was a very ordinary sentence in which an extraordinary thing had just taken root. She sought Harwood by the urn. It is a comfort to have matters settled, she observed, and yet one mustn't settle too soon. The doctor tells me cyanide acts within minutes. Mrs. Groves is certain she heard the Reverend call next after the veiled lady left. Perhaps 10 or 15 minutes passed before she looked in and found him. That would be rather a long interval for cyanide to behave itself. Harwood's expression tightened. He might have ingested it later. Lydia could have slipped a dose, which waited politely to act. Cyanide is not famous for good manners. She smiled to take the sting from it. Forgive me. I am an old woman who tidies times as other people tidy drawers. If the Reverend removed his stole, it was folded, you remember, and then called next. He was not, at that moment, receiving a penitent, and if he died soon after without putting the stole back on, then whoever came to him next was not a confessor but a colleague, someone for whom he would remove the symbol that belongs to sacrament. You see? Harwood stared at the steam rising from his cup. You're suggesting? I am suggesting that Lydia Harcourt brought wickedness and threat. Yes, but the interval belongs to someone else, and there are small things. The chemist sold the cyanide to a man-educated voice, gloved hands. The anonymous warning pushed through my door was written in a masculine hand, stiff with control. The handkerchief was a man's. Even the wax scrap by the confessional, the verger tried very hard to scrub it. A candle has its uses when one wishes to heat and seal a tiny packet of powder so that it may be broken quickly and without spilling. She paused, not looking at him. The Reverend, you know, had a delicate throat. Harwood's jaw set. If you've something to say about Pierce, say it. I have something to test, said Miss Marple simply. Truth does not, like being dragged. It comes more surely when invited. Allow me a small courtesy at the vicarage this evening, a gathering for those who helped with the flowers. Edith will not refuse it. Ask Mr. Pierce too, as a kindness. He looked as if he would argue, then thought better of it. A test? A very domestic one. I shall only watch how a gentleman takes a sweet. She smiled in that mild way that had undone more stubborn men than Harwood. When people are afraid, Inspector, their hands learn a different politeness. She walked home while the light thinned, the village settling again into its illusion of safety. On her table she laid out 4 things: the plain handkerchief, the anonymous note, a small tin of barley sugar she had purchased from the grocer, and a paper twist folded to look exactly like the kind that once contained a throat pastille. From her cupboard, she took a little bottle of almond essence and dabbed the tiniest ghost of it upon one sweet. Not enough to harm, only enough to wake a memory and watch who flinched. At dusk, Edith welcomed them, Harwood, Ellis, Mr. and Mrs. Groves, Mrs. Bantry, of course, and the young curate, whose eyes had the exhausted brightness of someone who has rehearsed innocence until it sounds like a prayer. They sat in the parlor where the photograph watched. Arthur's hand on a young man's shoulder. Miss Marple, fussing with saucers, became, as she often did, a piece of furniture. Do take a barley sugar, she said at last, offering the tin to the group, and then accidentally on purpose letting a paper twist slip to the carpet beside Mr. Pierce's shoe. He bent to pick it up. His fingers hesitated a fraction too long upon the crinkle of paper. His eyes, glancing up, met hers, and flickered once, the briefest tremor. "How thoughtful," he said. "He always found these soothing." Arthur did, Edith agreed, tears brightening her eyes. He could never preach without one in winter. "Miss," Marple nodded, her voice an old cat purr. "Such a comfort, when a friend remembers your weaknesses and tends to them. It is a thing one is grateful for forever, unless, of course, the sweet is not what it seems." The room changed then, in that subtle way rooms do when truth opens a window. Mrs. Grove's hands stilled, Ellis's head came up, Harwood's gaze tightened to a point. Pierce's smile remained, but it was a smile that had lost its place. Miss Marple arranged the tin back upon the tray and smoothed the plain handkerchief with one finger. "We mustn't hurry," she said, mostly to Edith, whose breathing had grown quick. "We must only be very clear. Some things in this dear parish were Lydia Harcourt's doing. But there is an interval, and intervals are all of murder. In that little space after she left and before the bells chimes told us the half hour, someone stood by a door he knew would be unlocked, heard a voice he knew would call next, and offered, through kindness, the very thing his friend could not refuse." Mr. Pierce's lips parted. "Miss Marple, yes, dear," she said gently, "I think we shall talk now. And perhaps, if you are very brave, we shall not need the handcuffs that make such an ugly clatter on a parlor floor." The room did not breathe. Mr. Pierce's hand hung half-extended, as if the paper twist burned cold. Miss Marple's gentle voice had found the hinge of the evening and turned it. Edith made a small sound. Inspector Harwood waited, not moving. "Talk," Miss Marple said, as one might suggest tea to a stubborn guest. Pierce lowered himself into a chair. The smile slid away. "You've decided I killed him," he said. "Then why ask me to speak?" "Because truth said aloud belongs to you," she answered. "Left unspoken, it belongs to the worst thing you fear." He swallowed. "I didn't mean for it to be like that." "How did you mean it?" Miss Marple asked. "With cyanide. One usually means finality." A tremor passed over his face. "It was mercy," he said. "He was going to denounce me on Sunday. I signed the check. Lydia pressed me to pay a debt she said would ruin us both. Arthur found out. He said I must confess to the bishop, resign, face whatever followed. He said truth was a surgeon. He never understood that surgeons still cut." Edith pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. "Arthur would have saved you." "He would have saved my soul," Pierce whispered, "but not my name, not my mother's pride. Not the vocation that was all I had done well. I thought if he were spared scandal, if he simply stopped, then the parish would remember him kindly, and I would have time to put the money back." Miss Marple's eyes were mild. "And so you brought him a sweet?" He looked at her with astonishment. "Yes," he said. "He had a cough. He always asked for a throat pastille before meetings. I prepared one. A paper capsule, sealed with wax, neat, tidy. I tested it. It broke at once. I told myself it would be quick." "The stole?" Harwood asked. "I folded it," Pierce said. "He had just finished with that woman. He called next and I came. He looked tired, kind. He said, 'My boy,' as he always did." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It was the neatness that undid you. The folded stole, the scrubbed wax, the letter pushed under my door. You even brought a monogrammed handkerchief tonight to replace the plain one you dropped that morning." He flushed. "I thought if everything were orderly, God might see the intention and forgive the act." "God forgives," Edith said suddenly, "but he does not mistake." Harwood stepped forward. "Evan Pierce, I must ask you to come with me." Pierce's shoulders sank, not in resistance, but in relief. "Will you let me speak for 5 minutes first?" he asked, looking at Edith. Not to plead, only to tell the truth where it was owed. Miss Marple touched Harwood's sleeve. 5 minutes, Inspector. It will save hours later. He nodded. Pierce turned to Edith. I loved him, he said. Not only as a son, I loved what he believed I could be. Lydia made me feel chosen. Arthur made me feel seen. When those two loves collided, I chose the one that protected my vanity. I was taught to prize a clean name. I thought cleanliness could be taken like a bath. He shook his head. I thought murder could be housekeeping. Edith's eyes closed. When she opened them, something steadier than grief had arrived. You will write to the bishop, she said. You will confess. I will, he said. Miss Marple set the barley sugar tin on the table. One thing more. Lydia did not kill your rector, but she nudged your weakness. Do not use her as excuse. Name your own. He nodded. I name it, he said. Cowardice. Harwood's hand found his arm. Come, he said, not unkindly. They went, without fuss. The door closed with that particular politeness houses reserve for sad departures. Edith stood very still. Will I hate him? She asked the air. Miss Marple took her hand. Some hates are heavy and cold. They harm the hands that hold them. You may put it down when you like. And Arthur? Edith whispered. What would he say? That truth is still a surgeon, said Miss Marple, and now it may heal. Outside, the bell sounded the hour. By morning, news would pour down the lanes. They would call the veiled woman the devil of it. They would praise the curate's tears. They would say, Miss Marple had known from the start. She had only watched the heart repeat itself. That night, after the carriage had taken Mr. Pierce away, Miss Marple walked home under a starry sky. In her cottage, she put the plain handkerchief into a drawer and washed the barley sugar tin. She would give it to the Sunday school. Then she sat by the window and took up her knitting. The needles clicked, counting a rhythm older than scandal. She thought of Arthur, who had folded his duty even at the end, and of Edith, who would now have to learn the slow art of forgiving. When the last row was finished, Miss Marple set the work aside and looked at the quiet square of the village. Peace did not mean silence. It meant voices telling the truth without dressing it first. She allowed herself a small, tired smile. Somewhere a cat stepped along a wall. Somewhere a kettle lifted its first whisper. The night, which had held its breath for days, breathed out.